Good afternoon, everyone. So happy to have you all here. I know there's still people joining us, and I will make note right away that we are recording this. So we will certainly post this on our social media or share it on our YouTube after this conversation. So I'm so excited to have you all here today. My name is Kathleen Yurchison. I'm the CEO of the Cape Breton Regional Chamber of Commerce here in the CBRM. And I'm incredibly excited about this conversation today. We have an incredibly special guest with us today, Ms. Deborah Gillis. And I think that this is such an incredibly important conversation, one that I feel like I've wanted to have for a while. So I'm so grateful for Deborah for lending her time to us today to talk about mental health and specifically how it presents itself in our workplace, in our personal lives, and what it actually means going forward as we move into a post-pandemic world. And I know I will acknowledge that we're still very much in the pandemic right now, but as we move through these phases and look more to the future in terms of where we're going next and what our new normal is going to be, there's a lot to consider when it comes to the mental health of the people that we work with, the people that we lead, even people in our own friend group and in our family. And fundamentally, I think the question for me has been, and a conversation that I've had with Deborah in preparation for today's conversation is, and Deborah put this perfectly, is that we're not the same people that we were 16 months ago. And maybe we don't realize that. And maybe we are just beginning to realize that. Or maybe you're somebody who has realized that a number of months ago, or in the even beginning of the pandemic as things began to change. So I think we've all experienced the last 16 months differently to some degree, although we know that there's commonalities, but we felt like it was really incredibly important to have this conversation today. And then maybe we might have a follow-up conversation in future. So without further ado, I'm so excited for this conversation. I think you will be too. And I think you'll be really inspired, and certainly you won't feel alone. So Deborah, thank you for joining us. I do want to start by introducing Deborah because I think she has an incredible bio. And for those who don't know, and I mentioned this on our Instagram yesterday and Facebook, is that Deborah is actually a Cape Bretoner. Of course, we're everywhere. We're all over the world doing amazing things. And Deborah is no different. So Deborah is from Port Hood. She's joining us from Toronto now, but Deborah has full plans on joining us back here in Cape Breton over the next couple of months as we reopen. I'm sure you're looking forward to that as well, Deborah. So thank you so much for joining us. I'm just going to say a few words about Deborah because I always feel like it's important to give some context of who we're talking to, and Deborah's no different. So Deborah is the president and the CEO of the CAMH Foundation, which is the Canadian Addictions and Mental Health Foundation. She is a recognized thought leader on gender equality, diversity, and inclusion. She has dedicated her career to driving social change. And she has a unique blend of passion, strategic vision, and entrepreneurial spirit in helping lead the CAMH Foundation in transforming how Canadians understand and address mental illness in the workplace and in society. Deborah's early work in the public sector focused on employment equity, anti-racism, and LGBTQ rights. She went on to become a consultant and practice leader with 2 global professional service firms. Deborah also worked for the Nova Scotia government and stood as a candidate for elected office. During her time in politics, she first truly understood the power of role models and urgent need for more of them to inspire girls and young women specifically. In her previous role as president and CEO of Catalyst, a global nonprofit, Deborah advised some of the world's most powerful CEOs and leading companies on how to accelerate and advance women into leadership. In 2016, Deborah was named as one of Canada Business Magazine's 10 most powerful business people and was awarded the Foreign Policy Association Medal. In 2017, she was appointed the Canada-United States Council for Advancement of Women Entrepreneurs and Business Leaders. And actually, Deborah, I don't have the date here, which I'm so sorry, but you actually have an honorary doctorate from Cape Breton University as well. What year were you honored with Cape Breton University?
2018, and I also was the proud recipient of an honorary doctorate from Mount St. Vincent as well.
Excellent, excellent, which is my alma mater, actually. So very cool.
But CBU was special to me. It really meant a lot to be recognized by the community where I grew up. So it was a really special moment.
That's fantastic. And I know that we actually have some CBU staff on here today and faculty, as well as I'm sure there's some alumni with us as well. So you're in good company. Okay, well, let's dive right into it. I know that we have lots to chat about, and I'm really hoping that we can cover as much as possible. I will make note to everyone who has joined us so far that Melissa, my colleague at the Chamber, has uploaded 2 incredibly helpful resources that Deborah and her team have provided us with that will marry well with today's conversation. But also in this general chat, please feel free to make comments, respond to anything that's really resonating with you, an opportunity to engage, but also to ask questions. And I'd be happy to take those and read through those as we near the end of the conversation, or if there's something that pops up that's relevant to the topic that we're talking about at that time, happy to interject and add that to our conversation in real time. So Deborah and I can both see this chat. I'll be looking at it quite closely as well. So I really encourage you to engage. All right, so let's dive right into it. And I think a really great place to start will be around mental health in general, and the fact that it has been such a pertinent topic over the past 16 months. And even as we move through the pandemic, into that 4 months, 6 month, and realizing, okay, this is not ending anytime soon, because I think we all entered March 15th. I know I did, and I still kind of have a little laugh about it to this day, that I was like 6 weeks, that's all we need to get through. We could do it 6 weeks. And here we are, June of 2021. And obviously we're seeing progress and we're seeing vaccines and all this stuff, but a lot has been the same. And it has been incredibly easy to get discouraged. And we all, something that somebody told me at some point during the pandemic is that, everything's so uncertain, but the future has never been certain. But there was an element of predictability that we used to have that we no longer have. And we have a lot of things changing all the time. And then when we add that layer on to the workplace, because most of us do work, certainly I would say everybody on this call today has some sort of employment, whether they employ themselves, they're self-employed, own a business, or are employed by an employer here in our community. The workplace has fundamentally changed. And so when we talk about mental health, which has been, a topic that has become more normalized with less stigma, of course, but still has some stigma, I think that these are still really hard conversations to have. And we struggle with how to have them with not only our friends, but our colleagues, and knowing what to say and leaning into that vulnerability. So I'm hoping that maybe that's where we can start, is around what does mental health mean right now in June 2021 after going through these past 16 months, and how does it present itself in the workplace, and what are we seeing in terms of what are the challenges, and maybe we can move into what are some things that we can start to consider.
It's a really great place to start the conversation. So thank you, Kathleen, first of all, for the opportunity to be with you. And I really wish I was in person with all of you, as I'm sure you do as well. It's nice for me to have an opportunity to connect with a group of leaders in Cape Breton, which is so close to my heart. The first thing that I'd say is, and this is something that has been an important message that CAMH has communicated for the last 16 months, and that is we were in a global mental health crisis long before the pandemic hit us. 450 million people worldwide live with mental illness. And so think about that number. This was a pandemic before COVID-19 hit us. But if over the course of the last 16 months, we've been tracking people's experience with mental illness. And what we found is that 1 in 5 Canadians have reported high levels of mental distress, anxiety, depressive symptoms, loneliness, and binge drinking are really high during the pandemic. I think it's interesting that the data also shows that there are gender gaps. So women are more likely to report anxiety than men. And those who have young children at home were also significantly more likely to report feeling depressed. And I think anyone who has been navigating, trying to work, trying to navigate everything that we're feeling and looking after their school-age children in particular has been really tough. But as I said earlier, the mental health pandemic was here before it became exacerbated by COVID-19. 1 in 5 Canadians experience a mental illness in any given year. 1 in 2 Canadians have or will have a mental illness by the time they reach 40 years old. So again, we can assume that half of the people on this call have or will experience an issue with mental illness. For me, what's interesting in this as we start to think about the workplace is that, of course, the majority of us spend the majority of our time, our waking hours on the job. And over the last year, those lines between home and work have really blurred. Work is often a place where we find purpose. It's a place where we connect with others. But at the same time, it can also be a source of stress. And I think we have to keep that in mind. 500,000 Canadians miss work each week due to mental illness. Mental illness is a leading cause and cost of disability in Canada. And in fact, by 2021, the cumulative cost of the Canadian economy is really significant. But think about that prevalence in the general population, in the working world, and then think about the fact that another study revealed that 3/4 of Canadians would not be willing or would be reluctant to tell a boss or coworker that they were living with mental illness. I think that really speaks to the level of stigma in workplaces. So think about, again, the prevalence prior to the pandemic, how it has been exacerbated during the pandemic. Pay attention to the fact that working parents and women have disproportionately been impacted. And then think about the fact that due to stigma and concern about how they will be perceived in workplaces, again, the majority of people feel reluctant to talk about their struggles with mental illness in the workplace. That kind of sets up a whole series of things about what businesses need to do, and in particular, what's the role of leaders as you think about navigating these issues, and again, in the return to the workplace environment.
Yeah, no, that's those stats are shocking, really. And, you know, I think it's an excellent point that this is not new, and it has only gotten worse. So let's just dive into that a little bit more in regards to, so we know based on the research and the statistics that it's very few people are willing to have these conversations with their bosses, with their direct managers. And then there's the other issue around direct managers or leaders not really knowing to have these conversations, possibly even proactively, with their employees, with their teams. So maybe so how can we do better? How can we do better around, you know, leaning into that vulnerability, because it is a scary place, but creating a safe space? How do we create safer workplaces where people do feel like they can talk about it and be open about it, and not have that fear or anxiety that they could lose their job or be viewed differently? Recognizing that, you know, everybody's different and every leader is different, but how can we start to be better in terms of as individuals to creating those safe spaces for people to feel like they can talk about this stuff?
Yeah, it's a really good question, Kathleen. I mean, I talk about the important role that leaders in particular play as what I call normalizers in chief. I think this is a really important role that we can play in organizations. And what I mean by that is really helping to reduce that stigma and concern about the impact that it might have in a workplace of talking about a mental illness or what someone might be struggling with. And this is where, to your point, the vulnerability of leaders in being open and talking about these issues, acknowledging personally the experiences that we've had, creates an environment or a sense of psychological safety in a workplace where if an employee hears a leader in their organization, a manager of their team, the president of their company, whatever it might be, talking about these issues and opening up a conversation, then it makes it okay for someone else to tell their story and to not fear that they are going to be judged or held back or looked at differently because they've been open. I think about a woman that I met in the last year, and she's someone who'd struggled with mental illness, and she had been diagnosed and was treated for her mental illness for 14 years. 14 years she hid it from her employer. She did not tell her employer. She did not tell her colleagues what she was experiencing. And I asked her what would have made a difference to her during that time in her life and her career. And she immediately, without kind of skipping a beat, said role models. Seeing someone succeed in her workplace that had the same struggles that she did. Seeing them succeed, hearing them talk about it would have made it okay for her to be open. And again, I frame this in the sense of the psychological safety, because in all of this work, what we're trying to do is create a workplace environment and a culture where people can authentically be themselves at work, where they can bring their whole self to the workplace. And if the environment is not one where these conversations are happening openly, then people are holding back. And if people are holding back who they are and are not able to be fully engaged, then frankly, there's a cost to the organization as well in terms of someone's engagement and productivity and all of those kinds of indicators that there's lots of data and evidence pointing to. So again, be the normalizer in chief. Open up a conversation and pay attention to what's happening with your team and your employees. I have lost Kathleen. There she is.
I am back. Sorry, I do not know what just happened there.
I was going to keep talking.
No, all good. I don't think we missed too much. Last thing you said was be the normalizer in chief. So really if you are a leader, be the example, be the role model.
Yeah. And Kathleen, I'd also say that while this role for leaders is really important, because again, seeing folks at the top of an organization or managers of teams being open about their experience is really important. I also want to make the point that we each have a role to play with our teammates and colleagues and people we work with every day. We spend a lot of time with the folks we work with. We see them, we know them, we often socialize with them. So I'd also encourage people to pay attention to signs or indicators from your team members that something's up. And it is paying attention. It's noticing whether there are changes in work habits or absenteeism or missed deadlines, or if you see changes in the personality or demeanor of a colleague, that they're responding in ways that just kind of seems not like them. If you hear colleagues really kind of verbalizing anxiety and fear that seems a bit out of touch with the facts. And what I mean by that is it's very normal. That's the first thing. It's very normal in this world that we've been living in to feel a sense of anxiety or to be concerned. we should be, and we have been, and that's normal. It's when you start to transition to feelings of anxiety or worry or fear that are beyond what might be considered normal, that we want to be paying attention and asking questions of our colleagues. And so I really think that we should all become comfortable with listening, paying attention, and then asking questions of our colleagues. And it can be as simple as saying, I've noticed something's different. Are you okay? That simple question, are you okay, can open up a conversation that makes it feel okay for someone to maybe share that they've been struggling in some way.
That's excellent. That's great advice. And I actually, my question before we got cut off, but you answered that, was I in my view anyway, is that how do we create those spaces? So I know a lot of leadership, I guess, thought leadership around leadership and how to lead, separate from mental illness, but just in general, talks about boundary setting, right? Like how far do you go into personal in the workplace? What is appropriate? You know, what is your business? Like what would be appropriate conversations to have with colleagues as opposed to maybe a conversation that you might have with a friend? But I think even asking that question and giving the permission for them to share, would that be fair, to giving the permission to share, and then they can kind of determine how much they are willing to share with you, but essentially opening up the door to create that space to have that conversation.
Yeah, that's exactly right. Opening up the door really matters. And as I said, I think a simple question of, look, I've noticed that something's different, or you seem different. Are you okay? And then you take your cues from the response from that person. And, you know, it needs to feel comfortable to them to share whatever's going on with them. I think knowing if your company or organization has resources available, if you have an EAP program, for example, and just being able to share that there's help available if someone needs it, that's really important as well. But yes, it's opening up a door that says to someone that it's okay to have the discussion, and that opening has been created. And again, I think that, you know, every leader is different, and folks are going to find on that spectrum of where they feel comfortable in sharing. But I do think that this is a moment when some vulnerability on the part of leaders can have a really important impact for others. And so, you know, I'll use myself as an example. I've been pretty open with my team on days when I've felt just kind of down or struggling, you know, and it's been a long haul for those of us, for example, living in Toronto, where we've been in lockdown for a long, long time. You know, just saying, like, I'm having a bad day. I'm not at my best today. I didn't perform at my best. Those kinds of things, again, those messages make others feel comfortable in being open with how they're doing as well.
So how can you, so I guess, and I'm kind of going off our questions here, but this is all such good stuff. So somebody does say that in a team meeting, let's say you're meeting or you're having an end of day debrief, and maybe somebody says, you know, I'm not having a great day, or this has been a really hard week for me. So that's to the point where your workplace or this team, said team, has created some level of comfortability, a safe space. So how do you support someone? So if I'm on the receiving end of that, or if you're on the receiving end of that, and I'm sharing this with you, how can we support those individuals? What, you know, and I think I myself as a person, you know, would, you know, I talk a lot. I tend to want to offer advice or what have you. But, you know, in terms of best practice, and maybe there isn't one. So this is, I guess, what I'm asking. But how can we support people when they do want to share? Is it just a matter of acknowledging that they did share and just, wishing, like hoping that, tomorrow's better, or is there ways in which we can do better when people are open with us about those things?
Yeah. First, I said earlier that I think it's important if you see and are observing something going on with a colleague to say, I see something's happening. Are you okay? That's not a conversation that I would open up in a group meeting. I mean, those are personal and often challenging situations. So find an opportunity privately to ask that question. But again, I think in the response to that, there's lots of different ways to think about, if someone says, yeah, I'm really struggling this week. It's been really hard. I've had, someone diagnosed with COVID, or someone's in the hospital, or someone's lost a job, or like there's just a myriad of things that can be going on and contributing to how someone's feeling right now. I think, again, knowing what resources are available in your organization and saying, you can talk to HR and they can help. We have an EAP program and there's resources there you can tap into. It's also just, I do think the listening, as you said, Kathleen, and responding with empathy and leading with empathy is really important right now. Some of the how we can help can come to, can I take some work off your plate? Or can we, if you're a manager, let's talk about a deadline that you might have. Like, what are some things that we can do in the workplace to kind of ease the burden? In my team throughout the pandemic, and from the very beginning, and I'm sure this is true of everyone on this call, we really started and went into the pandemic with a point of view that said, our first concern and priority is the safety of our staff, their health and safety and well-being of our staff. And everyone knew that that was the case. From a work perspective, we had a mantra that said, progress over perfection. And we used that mantra because it was really to say, we're working, we want to continue to move forward, but we also recognize that we're in an environment that means we might not all be working at our, optimal performance because of the way the world is around us. So the recognition of that said, our expectations are also aligned with the reality of the situation that we're in, can also help people to reduce the sense of pressure or stress that they might be feeling about work. So again, some of that conversation about, how can we help? Do you need time? Do you need, support with a deadline or a project that we can help you manage, can really relieve some pressure. But again, I do think that the empathy piece is really important, like hearing, seeing, understanding, expressing empathy for what someone's going through. And then again, trying to point to resources. CAMH has, we created at the beginning of the pandemic, a resource hub online for COVID-19. So it's at camh.ca. And there's a whole bunch of resources there that, folks can take a look at. And they include everything from kind of how to manage your anxiety, tips and tools and strategies during COVID. But there's also some self-assessment tools that, again, allow you to answer some questions that might help you understand, is what I'm feeling a normal response to the environment that we're living in and all of the stresses that we're facing? Or is there something here that maybe is more serious and might need some help from a professional? And so those kinds of tools and pointing people to them, I think, can also be really helpful in reassuring. Because again, reassuring folks that we're all feeling this in one sense or another, and it's perfectly normal to do so, can also help people.
Yeah, exactly. And I see that Sean said in the chat, it's creating that space of just listening, and that not being afraid of the silence, and just allowing someone to share, and not being so attached to how you're going to be responding, but rather just be there that understands. And I think you made such an excellent point, Deborah, where just listening, and for them now to know that you as a leader, or that the person listening as the leader knows that you are experiencing this, is probably a bit therapeutic in and of itself, right? It relieves that anxiety and fear around that they're hiding this, or that their boss or manager or supervisor or colleague doesn't know. So it kind of creates a space.
And it sends, like, at the core of that is sending a message to someone like, I see you. I see something's going on. Are you okay? That is leading from a place of concern and empathy and compassion for someone. It's not leading from a place that says, hey, you missed a deadline, like you're in trouble, or what's going on. Like that listening, care, and attention, I think is really powerful to how it makes someone feel. Because if someone feels seen, and that there is space and that caring in the culture and in the environment to be able to talk openly about what's going on. And remember, always remember in these conversations the degree of stigma that's associated with mental health issues. That's why I started with some of those key stats. Would any one of your colleagues hesitate or be concerned about saying, my child was diagnosed with, cancer yesterday, or my husband was, or someone had some other physical illness that they were dealing with? We'd probably be much more comfortable in talking openly about that to our colleagues, because the stigma isn't associated with that. And so always keeping that in mind of how hard it is for many people to talk about these issues in a workplace. By you opening the door, you're shifting that narrative about what's okay in our workplace to talk about.
Yeah, that's so excellent. Yeah, really. And yeah, just really, really good. Lots to think about. I want to touch on your comment around progress over perfection, and really the pressure to perform as we move out of this post-pandemic, or into a post-pandemic world, I should say. And, we know that economically, pretty much every organization will not come out of this unscathed, essentially, right? Either the level of demand on their organization was incredibly higher than what they would have experienced pre-pandemic, or there's the other side of the coin where the business has, suffered loss and inability to produce a level of revenue that they would typically rely on. There was more debt. So there's lots of anxiety. There's lots of fear. And I know that we touched on this in our previous conversation, Deborah, but around the fact that, this is not just going to go away. We're not going to one day wake up in a world post-COVID and things be normal and us kind of forget about the last 24 months or 18 months, whenever that may be. Like, it's not a light switch. Mm-hmm. So, but still the world keeps on spinning, as we know. And we know that with any level of grief or anxiety or something traumatic that we've experienced in our own lives, like you said, something that's more visible, like a loss of a loved one or something, that it's a process. And sometimes that process, depending on who you are, can last many years. It can last months. So how do we acknowledge that going forward? And I guess this is just as important for as leaders, but with the pressure that we also put on ourselves as individuals, as high performers and people that take, their job very seriously and have a lot of passion behind it, but just don't feel like they're performing the way that they maybe used to. And knowing that the pressure is coming down the pipeline, or it might already be there, might have been there this whole time, to keep on going.
Yeah. There's like so many layers to this, Kathleen. I'd start actually before we kind of shift to talking a bit about the post-pandemic world. Like, think about the pandemic world we've been living in and the numbers of people who have been working from home for the first time. So think about, as a leader in your organization, what that might mean for people who are trying to demonstrate that they are remaining productive, that they're getting work done, that, you know, they're contributing. So you again, think about those indicators that you just talked about of that any organization might be facing in terms of loss of customers or revenue, et cetera. Every employee wants to be able to demonstrate their value, to say, I'm contributing. And so even in this environment where we've been working from home, many people have felt that pressure. How do I make sure that my boss, my team, my organization understands, oh yeah, I'm doing a good job and I'm contributing to the organization? So that's real now. Then we start to think about what does that mean when we transition back into the workplace? And I think you're absolutely correct. And there isn't going to be a magic switch where we all go, okay, like everything's going back to normal. The world has shifted on its axis in many different ways. How we think about the use of technology, what we've learned about workplace flexibility and what our expectations are. You hear many organizations saying, we think we'll never go back to being in our workplace, 5 days a week, 100% of our team. There will be more flexibility. There'll be more expectation of it as people have demonstrated that they can work from home. Customers' preferences may have completely shifted as we've shopped online and all of those kinds of things. How has that shifted people's behaviors as we move forward? Particularly as people continue to have some concern for a period of time of the safety, physical safety, and re-engaging in some of those behaviors. Yeah, I'll use myself as an example. I look at scenes of sporting events and crowds of people gathered together without masks, and my first reaction is, oh my God, what are they doing? It looks like risky behavior to me. And it shows how something that was completely normal 16 months ago now feels like something that is like kind of wrong. How much of our thinking has shifted? And just because government guidelines or public health guidelines say, okay, now it's okay and people can go back to their workplace or open up their business or whatever it might be, people's level of concern for their own personal health and safety and that of their friends and family can still linger for some time. And I think that we have to be aware of that as we really think about bringing employees back to workplaces. So again, communication is going to be really important. And again, really opening up these kinds of conversations and talking about them openly of how people are feeling, teams and colleagues in organizations.
Yeah, it's tough. It's really tough because I think, we aren't the same people that we were 15 months ago.
Yeah.
And I actually have similar experiences, even in watching television shows and seeing somebody go into a restaurant on the television. This sounds so ridiculous, without a mask. Like, I've caught myself, not so much in recent weeks, but certainly at one point or another over the past number of months, thinking, oh my God, they're not wearing a mask when they go into the restaurant. So, but it also begs the question too, and I think it might show signs. And I've texted people in a fury when I saw, the Kentucky Derby or the, the Masters or whatever, these sporting events. But we live in a polarized world already, where we've become very sorted in the way in our views. And I know Brene Brown has talked a lot about this over her, in her books and on her podcast, but around, we have become so sorted where we surround ourselves with people who also think like us. and how that's not helpful. And when it comes to shaping perspectives and being empathetic and understanding other people's lived experiences and recognizing that they're not our own, right? Certainly as we become more and more sorted and surrounding ourselves with people who think like us. So as we move in this pandemic, because I think this is a very relevant topic right now, but post-pandemic, we have seen people with very different views on restrictions and when you should wear a mask, and are the phases the right phases, and why are they doing it this way? And we know, and we see that with vaccines as well, right? People choosing how long they should wait and what vaccine they should get, or if they should get a vaccine at all, and is it safe? And I just find this has just exacerbated the amount of pressure of knowing what is the right thing to talk about, and should we share our opinion on these things? And then when we think about it in relative to a workplace and creating these safe spaces and that psychological safety that you talk about, it's just so much more pressure to say the right thing and to lend our opinion. And, so is there anything that we can do as colleagues or as leaders where we can, be respectful of other people's opinions, but also, encourage, diversity in thought and diversity in opinion, and create those safe spaces to have those conversations, because these are all feeding into this fear and anxiety of this crazy pandemic world that we've all found ourselves in.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a really interesting question, because you're right. There's so many different people's point of views about should I have a vaccine and all of those kinds of questions. But I do think in workplaces that we will and should be guided by public health guidelines and what the science has told us. So that's the first thing, and that's the responsibility of leaders from both health and safety perspective and compliance with government guidelines and public health guidelines. And then I think there is the culture of your organization and what diverse points of view are heard and respected. And again, that does require a psychologically safe workplace where people can express their point of view, whether it's on this topic or any other, and feel that we may not all agree, but we're able to express what our point of view is and be heard and be respected for our opinion and not be judged for it. I mean, I think that that's true of any topic that we might discuss. And that's really the benefit, of course, of diversity and inclusion in any organization, is different points of view come to a table. It's how decisions get made, and we respect other people's point of view, even though that might not be one that we share. So I do think that those kinds of conversations in some ways will be guided by the culture of a workplace and comfort level with these kinds of discussions. But again, as an employer, we're all going to be guided by public health guidelines that are informed by science, and we're going to make decisions about how we bring people back to workplaces and what requirements are based on what those guidelines are.
So just to wrap up, we only have a few moments left, and I encourage, if anybody has any questions for Deborah, we'd love to see them in the chat. I know that there's some good conversation back and forth happening. But the last thing that I'm going to ask you is I know, and you already shared this, progress over perfection, right? Being more empathetic, listening, paying attention, asking those questions. Are you okay? I noticed something that's different. Are you okay? So and not to put pressure on you, that's all incredible stuff. So I don't imagine if you don't have anything else to offer that's really tactical and quick that we can take away from this conversation. I know that there's so many great resources, and we'll share those to our membership certainly after this call as well. But is there anything that we can do right now as individuals, that we could, that we can create a more psychological safety in our own social circles, in our workplaces, amongst our colleagues. And, what are some things that we can do right now that can help to encourage people to share, and create that safe space and introduce that safe space, maybe even for some people, where they feel like they can share and really express what they've been feeling, and knowing that it's okay, and that they're going to be heard.
Yeah, so I'm going to repeat myself a bit, Kathleen. I do think that it starts with you share first. That makes it easier and okay for someone else to share. Like you saying, this has been really hard for me. Here's what I've experienced. Here's how I've been feeling. And here's what that means for me in today, and I'm doing my work. So again, throughout the pandemic, as an example, I crafted all emails that went to all staff in our organization almost on a weekly basis. And sometimes it was sharing something that I thought might lift people's spirits. And sometimes it was sharing, you know what, this week has been really hard. It's been hard for me because of X, or here's how I've been feeling. And that has meant that I just haven't performed at my best this week, but that's okay. That's the thing that I kept saying to my staff is it's okay. We are not going to all perform at our very best, given what we're dealing with and feeling. That's okay. The more you can kind of share with people, to give them permission to feel what they're feeling and to recognize the reality of what people are dealing with. Again, think about parents of young kids who have had their kids at home, two parents working, they're trying to work, they're trying to fight for bandwidth, they're trying to keep their kids engaged. No one's going to be at their best in that environment, and making that okay for people to be open about it and just, acknowledging it. I think that acknowledgement of what people are feeling and going through really is important. And then, as I said, there's tools and tips and strategies of how to manage the anxiety that we're feeling. So one of the things that we did in my organization was we had a weekly, may have started out of 2 or 3 days a week, optional mindfulness session for staff that one of our board members actually held for us. We talked about some guidelines, for example, around what time of day meetings started and what time of day meetings ended. So again, recognizing when working parents might need to be dealing with kids starting school or ending a school day. Those kinds of simple things that recognize what people are dealing with can be really helpful in, again, having employees feel like, they see and understand what's going on in my life. They're sensitive to it. It's okay for me to talk about it. And they're actually, as an employer, kind of trying to help me navigate this as best I can. I think those kinds of things can be really helpful.
Yeah, no, that is amazing. And offering, I know that mindfulness has been something that larger organizations, even locally here in Cape Breton, have implemented. And from what I understand, has been just by virtue of offering that, demonstrates and opens up the conversation that it's okay. We recognize, here's some resources.
Well, and it's also just, it's sending a message and a reminder that there are things that we can do to help manage the stress and anxiety that we're feeling, that are good for both our mental and physical health. So it's making sure we get enough sleep. It's making sure that we are not drinking more than we should. It's making sure that we're taking time for whether it's meditation or mindfulness. Getting regular exercise, all of those kinds of things that, we know in the best of times are the things that we should be doing. But when we're under this kind of emotional stress and strain and dealing with all of this stuff, really paying attention to those things that have that intersection of our physical and mental health that can help us during these times is really important. So again, providing access to colleagues or team members or family members with some of those tips and tools of how you can navigate can be really important. And as I said earlier, we have lots of good examples on the CAMH.ca website in the COVID-19 hub. And I think that's one of the resources that Melissa was sharing.
Yes, yeah, exactly. And actually, speaking of resources, Sean actually just shared the mindfulness training sponsored by the Nova Scotia Health Authority. There's a link there, and it's free. So for those interested. So great. Thank you so much, Sean, for sharing that.
Sorry to interrupt, Kathleen. The other resource, and again, I think that you have this to share with folks, is the CAMH Foundation created what we call a playbook for business leaders. And it gives employers some strategies to put in place to address workplace mental health issues. And again, that might be a resource with some tools that are helpful for people. Again, the one that is probably in the current context of thinking about return to workplace, there's one of the recommendations is around planning for the return to work of someone who has been off dealing with a mental illness. And that's particularly applicable as we think about the post-COVID-19 work environment.
Yeah, that's excellent. Okay, we will absolutely make sure that we share that as well. That's fantastic. I know that we are almost out of time, but I do think Holly has a fantastic question in the chat, and I've just skimmed through it, but it seems as though it's addressing the whole notion of what I know to be comparative suffering, right? When we negate our own feelings at fear that somebody else is suffering more than us. So, and I know that I'm guilty of this. I have so many girlfriends that are guilty of this. It's like, they're struggling with something, but they say, but I shouldn't be struggling with this. So many people have it so much worse, right? I still have a job. I still can pay the bills, whatever, so they negate the way that they're feeling because they don't have all these other pressures or struggles that somebody else is experiencing caused by relatively the same thing. So for this example of obviously the pandemic. So, and Holly says, what if as a leader, you share your own challenges in an effort to normalize these conversations, but the unintended consequence is that staff do not want to add onto their manager's plate by opening up about their own struggles. Similarly, how can we acknowledge that so many of us are struggling without diminishing an individual's experience of the struggle, right? So, and for me, I see that as that there are people that, personally, I live alone. I don't have kids. So there has been times where I've caught myself like, I can't really say that this has been a hard time for me because I haven't had to have kids that are doing at-home learning. Like there's so many other people that have so much more on their plate. And fundamentally, other than me having to work from home, nothing has drastically changed in my life, right? But I guess the difference is, and I know I mentioned this to you, Deborah, is that I do live alone. So that's different. I'm not surrounded. I'm more isolated than maybe other people.
Exactly.
So it's finding that balance. So I think that that's a really good question that Holly asked. So how do we acknowledge when leadership is not supporting mental health, but the perceived repercussions of addressing this would just add to the stress? So by me as a leader, or you as a leader, Deborah, sharing with your team that you're having a hard week, and that could potentially eliminate or reduce someone's ability or want to come to you to tell them about their struggles because they know that you're struggling too.
Yeah. I mean, there's lots that I really agree with in what you've just said, and you can probably hear that phone ringing, which I'm going to try and shut off. First of all, you're absolutely right. And that everyone's circumstance is real for them and what they're feeling. And no person's situation is more relevant or important than anyone else's. So, Kathleen, you live alone. what that means in terms of the sense of social isolation that you might be feeling is real for you, and the changes to your life and your circumstances are as real as they are for anyone else who may have kids at home, as we were using that example, or whatever else it might be. So again, I think that that's the first thing, is that what is important and going on in your life is real and important for you, period. It is not measured against someone else's pain or suffering or grief that they might be experiencing. Second, I mean, I do think that as leaders, we do walk a balance between, again, being open and opening a door, and not kind of creating additional burden for staff, frankly, because there is a piece where, we carry a certain amount of being strong and being positive and focused for our teams and organizations. But again, I weigh the balance of opening a door, because if I share how I'm feeling, then that says to my leadership team, that's okay for them to talk about, which then makes it okay for someone on their teams to open up. They may not come and ask me a question, but they may ask a colleague. I think the power of opening this up outweighs some of those other concerns that it might hold someone back from asking. We know how important tone from the top is in so many different respects in organizations. And again, I think that leaders modeling a culture of openness and care and compassion and all of those things that we've been talking about in this conversation is really critical to then making it okay for others. But that also needs to be supported. And it's why I pointed to the playbook that CAMH created. It actually needs to be supported by a real plan and action. Like, is it all words of conversation, or do you have a plan, and do you provide training, and do you have resources that are available to your employees? And how do you respond to someone with what kinds of support or help when they identify that they're struggling with a mental health issue? So as in all things, credibility is backed up by how people, respond in those situations.
Yeah, all excellent points. And just based on what you just talked about, there's been a number of comments in the chat, basically reinstating exactly that. And I think Amanda made such a good point that, you talked about, Deborah, about 100%, like we're not bringing 100%. And I also agree with this, that people rarely bring 100% to, even, pre-pandemic, but it's asking yourself, what is 100% of my 60% today? If I'm only here for 60, what does it look like? Like what, but I also think to your, going back to the resources that you reference, is having some tools in your tool belt because if we do get to a point where we recognize that today or this week is a struggle, what are things that are going to help me to get back to whatever version of my percentage that I know that I can be back to? So, and to your point, and I know for me personally, that's getting out for a walk and, eating a healthy meal or calling a friend. It's not typically binge watching a television show for me, although I know that it is for others, right? It's just totally shutting things off and just kind of disengaging for a little bit. So what that looks to you might look different for somebody else, but I found I've really noticed tools that have fundamentally helped me. And I didn't necessarily see the benefits of that the very first time I started going up for a walk, but it was that cumulative effort of me realizing, okay, me going outside every day intentionally has really helped me and has made a difference compared to the previous number of weeks. So
yeah, I mean, I'll use the example. I mean, as people know, living in Toronto, we have been in the lockdown that you've experienced in Nova Scotia for the last few weeks or a couple of months. We've been living like this for a long time. So it meant that sense of, the kind of constraints on our freedom being in lockdown for many, many months. Like, we went into lockdown in November. So in case anyone's wondering, we've had no haircuts since November. Think about that for a second. But what I learned during that time was I could find myself never leaving my house, like literally not leaving my house. My groceries were all delivered to the front door. I am working from home. Everything is closed. You are going nowhere and you're not allowed to see people unless you make an intentional effort to say, it's actually not good for me to not leave my house. I need to get out and go for a walk around the block and get some fresh air. I need physically and emotionally for my ability to function. I need to do that, and I need to take time for exercise. I need to take time for meditation. All of those kinds of things you learn about yourself, of what's important to your ability to kind of navigate in this environment. And then I think it took some discipline to then say, okay, I need to prioritize that, because if I don't, I am not going to be functioning as well as I can possibly be functioning in this environment.
Yeah, it's so true. And I mean, to your point, like, there's other parts of this country, and you've experienced it firsthand, that have had so much limitations around their freedom. So you've lived your entire life having, living in a place that you've had so much freedom and ability, and all of a sudden that just went away, with no real warning at all. So I can, and I know that for us here in Cape Breton, and I know that you were here during part of this time, or right before it happened, is that we went from 0 to 60. Like, we had all this freedom, and then next thing you know, there was so much fear and so much anxiety within our community, especially here in Cape Breton, probably for the first time in 16 months, that COVID for the first time felt close.
Yeah.
That we knew people that were our teachers and our friends and our colleagues that were infected or had somebody close to them that were infected. So it just exasperated that level of fear, where we lived in a place for a long time that there wasn't, there were certainly people that did have fear to go to a grocery store, but generally speaking, it felt relatively safe if you followed all the rules and everything. So
yeah, I really observed that, because I was in Cape Breton at the time that the province went into the lockdown. And, I think that describes it really well. What I observed in my family was, again, from kind of feeling, aware and concerned, but not scared. Mm-hmm. And it felt like overnight, COVID-19 was on our doorstep, and it was like, and there was fear. And again, how people responded to that emotionally and how we were feeling of that level of fear kicking in, I think is real, and something that, again, we need to pay attention to in the people that we work with and our friends and family members, because it's hard to just then, as we talked about earlier, sort of flip a switch and then go, okay, it's okay now, and we don't have to be worried. It's hard, and for some people that's more challenging than others, and particularly for those, think about the many people who lost a family member during this time, whether it was to COVID or to any other illness. How have we been able to grieve? And when is that going to happen? So again, if you think about what's going to, of the pain and the continued mental health issues that people are going to face post-pandemic, or when we start to reopen and get back to some form of normal, how many people are going to be having funerals and grieving lost loved ones that they weren't able to do during those months that we were locked down? This isn't going just immediately go away in terms of the loss that we've experienced. And I think that we all need to be realistic in our expectations of that.
Yeah. Well, amazing.
I
Amazing.
was saying to my family, I've been living like this for a year. Welcome to my world.
No kidding. Honest to God. Well, and listen, I mean, I know all of us here in Nova Scotia have looked at places, especially like Ontario and Quebec, that, you know, to your point, like you have been in lockdown for the better part of this entire, so the, you know, what that actually means for our country and the mental health of our country, because we all have had different lived experiences. And I know myself, I have family in Ontario that have gone, you know, have had suffered immensely because of this. So it's, you know, even having these conversations with our family as they plan to come home this summer for the first time in 2 years, like that's going to be probably a very emotional experience for them.
For sure it is. And think too, you know, and this is true of members of my family that have family members who are working in Fort Mac and coming home, and how much anxiety that has created, both in the fear of those loved ones or family members who are away and working in areas where COVID cases have been high, and then coming home and the concern that that's created within their own families. So there's a whole bunch of issues here that, you know, I think that we need to all pay attention to. But I also think that as a province in Nova Scotia, you know, such a sense of pride of the leadership and Dr. Strang and how he has led for Nova Scotia during this time. And the province has done really remarkably well. And that's a good thing. And I hope also gives people, as we go through this next set of starting to reopen, et cetera. But I hope that gives people some sense of confidence as well, that that the province has done a really good job in managing this. That's partly why you had a different experience than many other parts of the country as well. And that's a strength from which you can then move on to the next phases of reopening. Yeah,
no, I agree. I mean, I think the sense of community, we know, and you know, from being from Cape Breton, it is different. People say it's different on the East Coast, but also you hear that it's different in Nova Scotia and Cape Breton. And I think we have really supported one another, and with the leadership of our government and Dr. Strang, and, you know, we've been so fortunate to have such a remarkable, I mean, it's very clear that he's a remarkable human. He's a remarkable man, and he's lived his life like that his whole life, to what I can gather. So, and so we've been so fortunate, but it doesn't negate the fact that, you know, especially over this past 8 weeks, that a lot has fundamentally shifted. And I think, even just from a mental well-being perspective, I think a lot of us thought that we were out of the woods. And then all of a sudden things just spiraled out of control. So how that affects us in terms of that fight or flight mode kind of response has absolutely been something that I think we've all experienced, and maybe it's still catching up to us, which also has effects on how we show up every day and how we show up for work and how that affects us.
It does for sure, because that kind of the fight or flight instinct and that adrenaline is, again, a natural thing that happens in our bodies, but it's intended to be short term, right? It's not intended to be something that, you know, goes on for a very long period of time. So again, how we start to peel back and recover from that is going to take time, and maybe different for different individuals depending on, you know, their circumstances and what they've experienced.
Gosh, yeah, that's such a good point, because and you've experienced this, but that, yeah, we've been in that mode, in that fight or flight for a long time. And it almost seems like it's going to be incredibly, well, it is going to be incredibly unusual when, and I'm hopeful for this time, but when we look back and say, remember when, but, you know, I think that this has been such an ongoing struggle. And for a lot of people, as everything, it's this changing environment all the time. We don't know what's next. It's incredibly unpredictable. So, but listen, I know that we're way over time. That was a wonderful conversation. I know people in the chat are already saying that you've given them lots to think about as they plan to reopen. And I think even just in our own personal lives, in our own family dynamics, as well as in our workplace. And we're so grateful to have this conversation, and we'll certainly be sharing it with our network because I think it's an incredibly important one, and one that is, to your point, as you opened up the conversation today, it's not something that's new. And maybe, relative to this whole conversation, there's a lot from COVID that has taught us a lot about how we need to be better. And I think that COVID has really, it was this globally shared experience, which at least in my lifetime, I can't think of a single other time where everybody around the world, in every corner of the world, has been touched by the same thing at the same time. And the degree of how it has affected them has been on obviously a scale, but we can all be empathetic to the fact that no one has come out of this without having some sort of connection or experience through all of this. So I think, hopefully this starts really important conversations in the workplace and lends itself to, especially on the topic of mental health, and lends itself to having these conversations post-pandemic around non-pandemic experiences, and just really creating a safe space and that psychological safety amongst our teams and in our leadership to allow for that space to share, free of stigma, hopefully, and have a place that we feel, safe and loved. And as you said so perfectly, we feel seen. So thank you so much.
It was a pleasure.
Thank you. And yes, Peggy, we will absolutely share this with you. So thank you, Deborah. Best of luck in Toronto. Safe travels back to the island, hopefully in the next number of weeks as we continue to reopen.
Hope to see you on the beach in Port Hood in the summer.
Yes, that would
Fingers crossed.
Fingers crossed. All right. Stay safe, everyone. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Have a great afternoon.